The voice that drifted through the open window of the weathered clapboard building stopped Jackson Jennings in his tracks, his dusty boots freezing mid-step on the wooden boardwalk of Petaluma, California. A voice so pure and tender it seemed impossible in this harsh frontier town of 1878. Jackson had ridden into town with a single purpose: to purchase supplies before the long journey back to his ranch 15 miles north, but that melodic sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket on a cold night, and he found himself drawn toward the source despite his better judgment. The building was modest, painted white once upon a time but now faded to a dusty gray, with a simple wooden sign that read "Petaluma Home for Children" hanging above the door. He approached the window carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening inside, and peered through the gap in the curtains. The interior was sparse but clean, with simple wooden benches lining the walls and a threadbare rug covering the center of the floor. Seated in a rocking chair was a young woman, perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun, wisps of it escaping to frame her face in the afternoon light. Her dress was plain gray calico, mended in several places but spotlessly clean, and in her arms she cradled a small child, no more than 2 years old, with tangled blonde curls. Around her feet, and scattered across the floor, sat at least a dozen other children, ranging in age from perhaps 3 to 12, all watching her with rapt attention as she sang. The lullaby was one Jackson recognized from his own childhood, something his mother had sung to him before she passed, and the memory of it brought an unexpected tightness to his chest. But it was not just the song itself that moved him. It was the way the woman sang it, with such genuine tenderness and care, as if each child before her was the most precious thing in the world. The children's faces showed the hard edges of frontier life, the kind of premature aging that came from loss and hardship, but as they listened to her sing, those edges softened. A little boy with a scarred cheek leaned his head against the knee of an older girl. 2 small children holding hands swayed gently to the melody. Even the older children, who might have thought themselves too grown for lullabies, sat with peaceful expressions, their eyes half closed. Jackson realized he had been standing there for several minutes, transfixed, when the song came to an end. The woman gently placed the sleeping child in a small cradle beside her chair and stood, stretching her back with a slight wince. She was slender, her movements graceful despite obvious fatigue. "All right, little ones," she said, her speaking voice as warm as her singing voice. "Time for afternoon chores. Remember, we all do our part to make our home a good place." The children scattered with surprising organization, each apparently knowing their assigned task. Some headed toward what looked like a kitchen area. Others began straightening the sparse furnishings, and the older ones helped the younger children with their duties. The woman supervised with gentle encouragement, praising a job well done here, offering patient guidance there. Jackson knew he should move along. That standing outside an orphanage window watching a stranger was not appropriate behavior for a respectable rancher, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was the ache in his own heart, the one that had been there for the past year since his wife Margaret had died, bringing their 3rd child into the world. The baby, a daughter they had planned to name Rose, had not survived either, and Jackson had been left alone with 2 young sons and a grief so profound, he sometimes wondered if he would ever feel whole again. His boys, Joshua and Jeremy, were 7 and 5 years old respectively, and they had grown quiet and withdrawn in the months since their mother's death. Jackson did his best, he truly did, but he was a rancher, not a mother, and he knew his rough hands and gruff manner could not provide what his sons needed. They needed tenderness, softness, the kind of gentle care he had just witnessed through that window. The housekeeper he had hired, Mrs. Donnelly, was efficient and kept the house in order, but she was a stern woman in her 60s with no patience for childish emotions. She fed the boys, kept their clothes clean, and maintained the household, but Jackson had never once heard her sing to them, never seen her gather them close for comfort when nightmares woke them in the dark hours before dawn. He was still lost in these thoughts when the door to the orphanage opened and the woman stepped out, a basket in her hands. She nearly collided with him, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh, I apologize. I did not see you there," she said, taking a small step back. Up close, Jackson could see that her eyes were a remarkable shade of green, like spring grass after rain, and there was a sprinkle of freckles across her nose. She was pretty in an understated way, the kind of beauty that grew more apparent the longer one looked. "No, madam, the fault is mine," Jackson said, removing his hat quickly. "I was standing where I should not have been." A slight flush colored her cheeks. "Were you listening at the window?" Honesty compelled him to nod. "I heard you singing as I was passing by." "I meant no disrespect, but the sound of it stopped me. You have a beautiful voice." Her expression softened slightly, though she still seemed uncertain about this tall stranger in dusty trail clothes standing outside her door. "Thank you. I am Penelope Calloway. I run this orphanage with the help of the church." "Jackson Jennings," he replied, extending his hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm when she shook it. "I have a ranch north of town. I was just in Petaluma for supplies." "I see." She seemed to be waiting for him to explain his presence further, her green eyes searching his face with a directness that was both unnerving and refreshing. Most women of his acquaintance would have looked away demurely, but Penelope Calloway met his gaze steadily. The words tumbled out before he had fully formed the thought. "I have 2 sons. They lost their mother a year ago. They need someone who can sing to them the way you were singing to those children." Penelope's expression immediately filled with sympathy. "I am so sorry for your loss, Mr. Jennings. Losing a mother is a terrible thing for children, for anyone. Would you consider coming to my ranch, just for an evening perhaps, to sing for them? I would pay you, of course." Even as he said it, Jackson realized how strange the request must sound, but he could not take it back now, and truthfully, he did not want to. Something in his gut told him this woman might be exactly what his boys needed. Penelope bit her lip, considering. "I cannot easily leave the children here. They require constant supervision, and I have no assistant at present." "Could they not come with you?" The suggestion surprised even Jackson, but once made, it seemed right. "My ranch is large. There is plenty of space. Perhaps an afternoon in the countryside would be good for them as well." "That is quite an unusual proposition, Mr. Jennings." "These are unusual circumstances, Miss Calloway." He met her eyes earnestly. "I am not making improper suggestions. My housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, would be present, and you would have a dozen children as chaperones. I am simply a father who heard something his children desperately need, and is hoping you might share that gift with them." Penelope studied him for a long moment, and Jackson had the distinct impression she was seeing straight through to his soul, measuring the truth of his words and the sincerity of his intentions. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "Very well. Sunday afternoon, if the weather holds. The children would enjoy an outing, and it would be Christian charity to help motherless boys." Relief flooded through Jackson with surprising intensity. "Thank you, Miss Calloway, truly. Shall I send a wagon for you?" "I have one large enough to accommodate everyone." "That would be helpful, yes. We have a small cart, but not enough to transport everyone comfortably." She shifted the basket in her arms. "I must get to the general store before it closes." They sometimes have day-old bread they will sell cheaply, and with 13 mouths to feed, every penny must be stretched. 13 children in your care? Jackson asked, surprised. 14 as of last week. A baby was left on the doorstep. People know we will take in children who have nowhere else to go. There was no resentment in her voice, only a quiet acceptance of responsibility. The church provides some support, and kind townspeople donate what they can, but it is never quite enough. An impulse struck Jackson, the same kind of instinctive decision that had led him to ask her to sing for his sons. "Miss Calloway, what if I provided meat for your orphanage? Beef from my ranch delivered weekly. Fresh meat for growing children." Her eyes widened. "Mr. Jennings, that would be far too generous. Not at all. I have more than enough cattle, and it seems a fair exchange for you bringing joy to my sons." He settled his hat back on his head. "Consider it arranged. I will send the first delivery with the wagon on Sunday." Before she could protest further, he tipped his hat and walked away, his stride purposeful as he headed back toward where he had left his horse. Behind him, he heard her call out a thank you, her voice carrying a note of bemused wonder. The next 3 days passed with unusual slowness. Jackson threw himself into ranch work with his usual dedication, but his mind kept drifting to Sunday afternoon, to Penelope Calloway's green eyes and the way tenderness had radiated from her as she sang to those orphan children. He told Joshua and Jeremy that they would have visitors on Sunday, children from the town orphanage and the woman who cared for them, but he did not mention the singing. He wanted to see their reaction when they heard her voice for the first time. Mrs. Donnelly had pursed her lips when he informed her of the impending visit. "An orphanage full of children descending on this house. It will be chaos, Mr. Jennings." "Then it will be chaos," Jackson had replied firmly. "Prepare refreshments, please. Lemonade and whatever cakes or cookies you can manage." The housekeeper had muttered something under her breath about foolish notions, but set about her preparations nonetheless. Jackson spent Saturday evening with his sons, reading to them from a book of frontier tales before tucking them into bed. They were good boys, quiet and well-behaved, but there was a sadness in their eyes that never quite went away. Joshua, the older boy, had started taking on responsibilities beyond his years, trying to be the man of the house in miniature. Jeremy, who had been a chattering, energetic child before his mother's death, now spent hours in silence, playing alone with his wooden toys. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the California sky a brilliant blue unmarred by clouds. Jackson hitched up his largest wagon, the one he used for hauling supplies, and lined it with clean hay and blankets to make it comfortable for passengers. Then he drove into Petaluma, arriving at the orphanage just after the church bells rang noon. Penelope was ready. The children assembled in front of the building in their Sunday best, which ranged from neatly mended dresses and shirts to garments that were more patch than original fabric. Their faces were scrubbed clean, and their hair had been brushed and braided or combed flat. Despite their worn clothing, they looked like children readying for an adventure, eyes bright with anticipation. "Good afternoon, Miss Calloway," Jackson said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Are we ready for an outing? As ready as we can be, Mr. Jennings." Penelope wore a dress of soft blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and she had a shawl draped over her shoulders. In her arms, she carried a bundle that he guessed was the baby she had mentioned. "Children, this is Mr. Jennings. We are going to visit his ranch this afternoon. I expect everyone to be on their best behavior." A chorus of "yes, Miss Penny" answered her, and Jackson smiled at the affectionate nickname. He helped the older children climb into the wagon bed, then assisted Penelope up to the seat beside him, trying not to notice how his hands nearly spanned her slender waist, or how a faint scent of lavender clung to her hair and clothes. The drive north took nearly an hour, during which the children exclaimed over every cow, every hawk circling overhead, every interesting rock formation. Penelope answered their questions patiently, turning each observation into a gentle lesson about nature or the world around them. Jackson found himself as captivated by her teaching as the children were, impressed by her knowledge, and the easy way she engaged their curious minds. "You are good with them," he observed during a brief lull in the conversation. "They are good children," Penelope replied, adjusting the baby in her arms. "People often assume orphans are somehow damaged or difficult, but in my experience, they simply need what all children need: love, structure, guidance, and the security of knowing someone cares for them." "How did you come to run an orphanage?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious. Penelope was quiet for a moment, her gaze fixed on the rolling hills ahead. "I was an orphan myself. My parents died when I was 8, victims of cholera. I was fortunate enough to be taken in by a kind woman who ran a home for children in Sacramento. She taught me to read and write, to sing, to see beauty in the world despite hardship. When she passed away 5 years ago, she left me a small sum of money. I used it to start the orphanage in Petaluma. That was a selfless choice. You could have used that money to secure your own future, perhaps find a husband and settle down." A slight smile curved her lips. "What makes you think running an orphanage is not securing my future, Mr. Jennings? Those children are my purpose. As for a husband, I have yet to meet a man who would understand that my calling is not something I would abandon for the sake of conventional domesticity." Jackson considered this, recognizing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Penelope Calloway was no timid wallflower hoping for rescue. She was a woman who had found her purpose and pursued it with determination. He respected that, even as a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps the right man would not ask her to abandon her calling, but would instead support it. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill, a sprawling structure of wood and stone that Jackson had built with his own hands over the years. It was surrounded by corrals and outbuildings, with pastures stretching in every direction where cattle grazed peacefully. Penelope drew in a breath, and Jackson felt an unexpected pride at her reaction. "It is beautiful, Mr. Jennings. You must work very hard to maintain all this." "I have good ranch hands," Jackson said modestly. "But yes, it takes constant work. The land provides, but only if you tend it properly." Joshua and Jeremy had apparently been watching for the wagon because they came running out of the house as Jackson pulled to a stop, Mrs. Donnelly trailing behind them at a more sedate pace. Both boys stopped short when they saw the wagon full of children, sudden shyness overtaking their initial excitement. "Boys, come here," Jackson called, climbing down and then turning to help Penelope. "I want you to meet Miss Calloway and her children." Penelope handed the baby to one of the older girls in the wagon and allowed Jackson to help her down. She immediately knelt to be at eye level with Joshua and Jeremy, her smile warm and welcoming. "You must be Joshua and Jeremy. Your father told me about you." "I am Miss Penelope, but most children call me Miss Penny. We have come to spend the afternoon with you, if that is all right." Joshua, ever the responsible older brother, nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam, that would be all right." Jeremy, however, seemed mesmerized by Penelope's kind face. He took a tentative step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. "You are pretty," he said simply. Penelope laughed, a sound like water over stones, clear and bright. "Thank you, Jeremy, that is very kind of you to say." Mrs. Donnelly had reached them by then, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp as she took in the scene. "Mr. Jennings, I have prepared refreshments in the parlor as requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Donnelly." Jackson began helping the children out of the wagon, introducing each one to his sons as they climbed down. There was Emma, the oldest at 12, who had appointed herself Penelope's assistant. Twin boys, Thomas and Timothy, who were 10 and full of boundless energy. 8-year-old Sarah with her serious dark eyes. The list went on, each child unique, each carrying their own story of loss and survival. The house, usually so quiet it echoed, suddenly filled with the sound of children's voices. Mrs. Donnelly served lemonade and sugar cookies, her stern expression softening slightly as she watched the orphans thank her politely and eat with obvious enjoyment. Penelope kept a watchful eye on all of them, gently correcting table manners when needed but mostly allowing them to simply be children, to enjoy the treat and the newness of their surroundings. Jackson noticed that his own sons remained somewhat apart from the group, watching but not quite joining in. Joshua stood near his father, his small hand occasionally reaching out to grasp Jackson's sleeve, while Jeremy sat on the bottom step of the staircase, his thumb creeping toward his mouth, a habit he had developed since his mother's death. Penelope noticed too. Once the children had finished their refreshments, she suggested they go outside to explore the ranch, under the supervision of Emma and the other older children. Mrs. Donnelly agreed to keep watch from the porch, and soon the house was quieter, though the sounds of play drifted in through the open windows. "Jeremy," Penelope said softly, approaching the two boys, "would you like to show me your favorite spots on the ranch? I am sure you know places the other children would not discover on their own." Jeremy's thumb popped out of his mouth. "There is a creek with frogs," he offered hesitantly. "I love frogs," Penelope said with such genuine enthusiasm that Jeremy's face brightened. "Would you show me?" The boys led Penelope outside, and Jackson followed at a distance, curious to see how she would draw out his reserved sons. They walked across the yard toward a small creek that ran along the edge of the property, the same creek where Jackson had played as a boy when this had been his father's ranch. Penelope sat on a large flat rock beside the water, arranging her skirts carefully, and patted the spaces on either side of her. The boys sat, Joshua still cautious but Jeremy already warming to her presence. For several minutes, they simply watched the water flow by, occasionally spotting a frog or a water beetle. Then, so naturally it seemed like breathing, Penelope began to sing. Not a lullaby this time, but a cheerful song about a frog who wanted to court a mouse, full of silly verses that made the boys giggle. By the second verse, Jeremy was bouncing on the rock in time with the music. By the third, even Joshua was smiling. Jackson leaned against a fence post, watching the scene unfold with an emotion he could not quite name tightening his chest. This was what had been missing from his house, from his sons' lives. Not just singing, but joy. Light. The presence of someone who knew how to draw children out of their shells with patience and genuine care. When the song ended, Jeremy immediately begged for another. Penelope obliged with a song about a train chugging across the prairie, complete with sound effects that had both boys laughing outright. The sound of their laughter, so rare in recent months, struck Jackson with the force of a physical blow. He had not realized how much he had missed hearing them happy. After several songs, Penelope transitioned into conversation, asking the boys about the ranch, about their days, about their favorite things. She listened to their answers with complete attention, never dismissing their thoughts or rushing them along. Gradually, the boys began to open up, telling her about their horses, about lessons with Mrs. Donnelly, about the time Jeremy had found a bird with a broken wing and they had nursed it back to health. "You are very caring boys," Penelope said warmly. "Your mother would be proud of you." The mention of their mother brought a moment of silence. Joshua's smile faded and Jeremy's lower lip trembled slightly. Penelope did not shy away from the sadness. Instead, she said gently, "It is all right to miss her. Missing someone means we love them very much. Your father told me she is not with you anymore, but I am sure she loved you both with all her heart." "She did," Joshua said quietly. "She used to sing to us sometimes, before bed." "What did she sing?" Penelope asked. "I do not remember all the words," Joshua admitted, his voice small. "It has been a long time." Jackson stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer. "She sang 'Hush, Little Baby,'" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That was her favorite." Penelope looked up at him, understanding in her eyes, then turned back to the boys. "Would you like me to sing it for you, so you can remember?" Both boys nodded, and Jeremy scooted closer to Penelope, leaning against her side. She wrapped an arm around him naturally, while her other hand reached out to touch Joshua's shoulder. Then she began to sing, her voice soft and sweet, carrying the familiar words and melody that Margaret had once filled their home with. Tears pricked at Jackson's eyes, the first he had allowed himself since the funeral. Not tears of pain, though there was still pain aplenty, but tears of something else. Gratitude, perhaps, that his sons were being given this gift of memory and comfort. Relief that they were finally being offered the tenderness they needed. When the song ended, both boys were crying quietly, not the desperate sobs of fresh grief but the gentler tears of healing. Penelope held them, murmuring soft words of comfort, and Jackson found himself moving closer, crouching down beside the rock to gather all three into an awkward embrace. It was the first time since Margaret's death that he had held his sons while they cried, had allowed them to express their sadness rather than encouraging them to be brave little men. They stayed that way for several minutes, a tableau of shared grief and tentative healing beside the creek. Finally, the boys' tears subsided and they pulled back, wiping their faces with their sleeves. Jeremy looked up at Penelope with swollen but clearer eyes. "Will you come back and sing for us again?" he asked. Penelope glanced at Jackson, a question in her gaze. He nodded almost imperceptibly, not trusting his voice yet. "Yes," Penelope said. "I would be happy to come back and sing for you whenever you like." The afternoon continued in a lighter vein after that emotional moment by the creek. The orphans had found the barn and were fascinated by the horses and cattle, and Joshua and Jeremy, feeling more comfortable now, began to show them around with shy pride. Penelope walked alongside Jackson, the baby once again in her arms as the infant had begun to fuss and needed soothing. "Your sons are wonderful boys," Penelope said as they watched the children explore. "They have been through so much, but they have good hearts." "They need more than I can give them," Jackson admitted. "I love them fiercely, but I am just one man and a rough one at that. They need softness, gentleness. They need what you gave them today." Penelope was quiet for a moment, rocking the baby gently. "Children need many things, Mr. Jennings. They need firmness as well as gentleness, strength as well as tenderness. You provide what you can, and it is clear they adore you. But you are right that they need more than one person can give. All children do." "Then come back," Jackson said, the words coming out more forcefully than he intended. "Not just once, but regularly. Come every Sunday, bring the orphans. Let them play here. Let them have space to run. Let my boys have other children to play with, and let them have your presence in their lives. Mr. Jennings, that is a significant commitment you are proposing. I know, and I am prepared to make it worthwhile for you and your orphanage. Regular meat deliveries, as I promised, but also vegetables from my garden, milk from my dairy cows, whatever you need." and perhaps a small salary for your time to help support the orphanage's other needs." He paused, then added, "I am not trying to purchase your company, Miss Calloway. I am trying to create a situation that benefits everyone involved. Your orphans would have a place to play and explore. My sons would have companionship and your gentle care, and you would have resources to help you continue your important work." Penelope studied him with those penetrating green eyes, and Jackson met her gaze steadily, letting her see his sincerity. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Very well. Sunday afternoons, weather permitting. But Mr. Jennings, I want to be clear that this arrangement is about the children, yours and mine. It is not a courtship or anything of that nature." "Understood completely, Miss Calloway," Jackson agreed, even as a small part of him wondered if that was entirely true, if there was not already something growing between them that went beyond concern for children. The weeks that followed established a pattern that quickly began to feel like tradition. Every Sunday after church, Jackson would arrive in Petaluma with his wagon, and Penelope would have the orphans ready for their weekly outing. The children grew comfortable with the routine, looking forward to their afternoons at the ranch with visible excitement. The benefits were immediately apparent. The orphans, confined most of the week to the small building in town, flourished with the freedom to run and play in open spaces. They learned about ranch life, helping to collect eggs from the chickens, watching the horses being groomed, learning to identify different types of cattle. Emma, the oldest girl, developed a particular fondness for the horses and began to show a real aptitude for working with them. Joshua and Jeremy transformed before Jackson's eyes. Having other children to play with drew them out of their shells, and Penelope's weekly presence gave them an anchor of gentle femininity they had been missing. She sang to them every visit, sometimes lullabies at nap time, sometimes work songs as they did simple chores together, sometimes just cheerful tunes as they walked around the property. But it was not just the children who were changing. Jackson found himself looking forward to Sundays with an eagerness that surprised him. He took care with his appearance, making sure his shirt was clean and his hair was neatly combed. He found excuses to walk beside Penelope as the children played, to engage her in conversation about everything from the weather to books to their philosophies on raising children. Penelope, for her part, seemed to enjoy their conversations as well. She was intelligent and well-read despite her limited formal education, with strong opinions delivered in her gentle but firm manner. They discovered shared views on many topics, but were different enough to make their discussions interesting. Jackson found himself thinking about things she had said long after she had returned to town, pondering her perspectives and finding his own views shifting and expanding. Mrs. Donnelly noticed the change in the household and, in her gruff way, approved. "The boys need a woman's touch," she said one evening as she and Jackson cleaned up after a Sunday visit. "And you are smiling more, Mr. Jennings. It is good to see." "Am I?" Jackson asked, surprised. "You are. Miss Calloway is a good woman, sensible, kind. The children love her, all of them." The housekeeper paused, then added, "You could do worse than to court her properly." Jackson felt heat rise to his face. "Mrs. Donnelly, it is not like that. This is an arrangement for the benefit of the children." The older woman made a sound suspiciously like a snort. "If you say so, Mr. Jennings. But I have eyes, and I can see the way you look at her when you think no one is watching." After she left the kitchen, Jackson sat alone at the table, his untouched coffee growing cold before him. Was Mrs. Donnelly right? Was he developing feelings for Penelope Calloway beyond gratitude and respect? The thought unsettled him, not because it was unwelcome, but because it felt like a betrayal of Margaret's memory. He had loved his wife deeply, had mourned her profoundly. Was it wrong to find himself drawn to another woman barely a year after her death? But then he thought about Margaret herself, about the kind, generous woman she had been. She would not have wanted him to remain alone forever, would not have wanted their sons to grow up without a mother's love. She would have wanted him to find happiness again, to give Joshua and Jeremy the family they deserved. The realization was both freeing and terrifying. Jackson acknowledged, sitting there in his quiet kitchen, that he was indeed falling in love with Penelope Calloway. He loved the way she sang, the way she cared for children, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about something she was passionate about. He loved her strength and her gentleness, her intelligence and her compassion. He loved the way she made his house feel like a home again, the way she brought light and laughter back into his sons' lives. But did she feel anything for him? Their arrangement was, as she had made clear, about the children. She had shown no indication that she thought of him as anything more than a benefactor who helped support her orphanage and provided a place for her charges to play. The thought that his feelings might be one-sided was painful, but Jackson was not a man who shied away from difficult truths. He decided to continue as they had been, to maintain the Sunday arrangement and to simply appreciate Penelope's presence in their lives without pushing for more. If his feelings deepened, well, he would deal with that privately. The children's well-being was what mattered most. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Sunday in late October when the equilibrium they had established was disrupted. The day had started normally enough, with Jackson collecting Penelope and the orphans and bringing them to the ranch. The weather had turned cooler, and Penelope had brought blankets for the children to wrap up in as they played outside. They had all been engaged in a game of tag near the barn when Jeremy had tripped and fallen, scraping his knee badly on a rock. His cries brought all the adults running. Penelope reached him first, gathering him into her arms with practiced ease. "Let me see, sweetheart," she said gently, examining the injury. "It is a nasty scrape, but you are going to be just fine." Jeremy was crying in earnest now, his small body shaking with sobs. "It hurts," he wailed. "I know it does," Penelope soothed, carrying him toward the house. "We are going to get you all cleaned up and bandaged, and I will sing you your favorite song while we do it. Would you like that?" Jeremy nodded against her shoulder, his cries already beginning to subside at her comforting presence. Jackson followed them into the house, feeling somewhat helpless, as he often did when his children were hurt or upset. Penelope seemed to know exactly what to do, though, settling Jeremy on the kitchen table and calling for clean water and bandages. As she cleaned the wound, singing softly all the while, Jackson watched the way she tended to his son. Her movements were efficient but gentle, and she talked Jeremy through each step, explaining what she was doing and why. By the time she had the scrape bandaged, Jeremy was no longer crying, though he was still sniffling occasionally. "There now," Penelope said, lifting him down from the table. "All better. You were very brave." Jeremy wrapped his arms around her neck. "I love you, Miss Penny," he said simply. The words hung in the air, profound in their childish innocence. Penelope's expression softened and she hugged Jeremy close. "I love you too, sweetheart. You and your brother both." Joshua, who had followed them inside and was standing in the doorway, stepped forward hesitantly. "Really?" he asked, his voice small. "You love us?" Penelope opened one arm, inviting him into the embrace. Joshua came willingly, and she held both boys, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes, really. You are both very special boys, and I am grateful to know you." Jackson felt his heart clench at the scene. His sons, motherless for a year, had found someone who could love them again, someone who was not obligated by blood or duty, but chose to care for them out of genuine affection. And Penelope, he realized, had found children to love as her own, Not just her orphans, but his boys too. The moment was broken when one of the orphans called for Penelope from outside, needing help with something. She reluctantly released Joshua and Jeremy, promising to check on them again soon, and went to attend to her other charges. But the incident had shifted something, bringing into the open what had been growing beneath the surface. That evening, as Jackson drove Penelope and the orphans back to town, she was quieter than usual. The children dozed in the back of the wagon, tired from their active afternoon, and the adults sat in companionable silence as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples across the western sky. "Your sons are very special to me," Penelope said finally, breaking the quiet. "I hope you know that." "I do," Jackson replied, "and it is clear they feel the same way about you. When Jeremy said he loved me today, it struck me how attached we have all become. These Sunday visits started as a practical arrangement, but they have become something more." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I worry sometimes that I am overstepping, getting too involved in your family's life." "You are not overstepping," Jackson said firmly. "Penelope, you have brought light back into my house, into my sons' lives. I am more grateful than I can express." She turned to look at him, her face barely visible in the gathering dusk. "And what about you, Jackson? Has this brought anything to your life beyond help with your children?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips sent a warmth through his chest. He considered how to answer, whether to be safe and keep his feelings hidden or to risk honesty and possible rejection. He chose honesty. "Yes. It has brought me joy I did not think I would feel again. It has brought me companionship and conversation that I value deeply. It has brought me you, Penelope, and that is a gift I treasure." Her breath caught audibly. "Jackson, I need you to understand something. My life is dedicated to those orphans. I cannot abandon them, not for anything or anyone." "I would never ask you to," Jackson said. "I know who you are, Penelope. Your dedication to those children is part of what I admire about you." "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am saying that I have feelings for you that go beyond gratitude or friendship. I am saying that over these past months, I have come to care for you deeply." He took a breath, then continued. "I am saying that I think I am falling in love with you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Jackson kept his eyes on the road ahead, giving her time to process his confession, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "I have feelings for you too," Penelope said finally, and Jackson's breath released in a rush. "But Jackson, the situation is complicated. You need a mother for your sons, and I have 14 children who already depend on me. I cannot simply move to your ranch and leave them behind." "Then do not leave them behind," Jackson said, the solution suddenly seeming obvious. "Bring them with you. The ranch house is large, and I can add on rooms if needed. There is plenty of space, plenty of work for everyone to contribute to. We could create a home for all of them, for all of us." "You cannot be serious. Taking on 14 additional children," Penelope sounded stunned. "Why not?" "I have the resources to support them, and they already love it here. Emma has a gift with horses. Thomas and Timothy are constantly asking my ranch hands questions about cattle. Little Sarah told me last week that she wants to learn to make cheese from our dairy cows. They are good children who deserve a real home, not just an orphanage in town." He paused, then added quietly, "And I want you in my life, Penelope. I want to build a future with you. If that means taking on your orphans, then I welcome them gladly." Penelope was crying now. He could hear it in her voice. "You do not know what you are offering. Children are expensive, demanding. 14 of them would turn your life upside down." "My life was already turned upside down when I lost Margaret," Jackson said. What you are offering is a chance to turn it right side up again, to fill my house with life and laughter, to give my sons siblings and playmates, to give those orphans a real family, and to give us, you and me, a chance at happiness together. The wagon had reached the outskirts of Petaluma. Jackson pulled to a stop in front of the orphanage, then turned to face Penelope directly. In the moonlight, he could see tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she said simply. "I did not plan to. I told myself this was just about the children. But somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you, Jackson Jennings. With your kindness and your strength, with the way you love your sons, with the generous heart you try to hide beneath your rough exterior." Joy flooded through Jackson, more powerful than any emotion he could remember feeling. He reached out and cupped Penelope's face in his work-roughened hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. "Then marry me," he said. "Marry me and bring your orphans to my ranch. Let us create a family together, bigger and louder and more chaotic than either of us planned, but full of love." "Yes," Penelope breathed. "Yes, Jackson, I will marry you." He kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that held the promise of a future together, of love found in unexpected places, of healing and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling through their tears. Behind them, someone cleared their throat. They turned to find Emma standing there, a knowing smile on her young face. "We have been awake for the last several minutes," she said matter-of-factly. "And we all think you should definitely get married. The children have been hoping for it for weeks." Laughter bubbled up from both adults, breaking the intensity of the moment. The other orphans, no longer pretending to sleep, voiced their enthusiastic agreement. Even baby Ruth, who had woken at some point, gurgled happily as if adding her blessing. The next weeks were a flurry of activity and planning. Jackson's proposal had been accepted not just by Penelope, but by the entire community of Petaluma, which had watched the growing relationship with interest. The church that supported the orphanage agreed to transfer its modest funding to help with the children's care at the ranch, pleased that the orphans would have such a good home. Jackson hired builders to expand the ranch house, adding wings of bedrooms to accommodate all the children. The orphans threw themselves into the preparations with enthusiasm, helping where they could and excitedly planning how they would arrange their new home. Joshua and Jeremy were overjoyed at the prospect of having so many siblings, and the bond between all the children grew stronger daily. Mrs. Donnelly, when informed of the engagement, had simply nodded and said, "About time." She agreed to stay on as head housekeeper, which was a relief as managing a household of 16 children would require all the help they could get. Penelope and Jackson were married on a crisp December morning in the Petaluma church, with all 16 children in attendance. Emma served as Penelope's attendant, and Joshua stood proud as his father's best man. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the children cheered so loudly it echoed off the church walls. The wedding breakfast was held at the ranch, where neighbors and ranch hands had helped set up tables in the barn, decorated with winter greenery and ribbons. There was music and dancing, and at one point, all the children formed a circle and demanded that Penelope sing for them. She obliged, her voice clear and sweet, and Jackson watched his new wife surrounded by their children, his heart so full he thought it might burst. That night, after all the guests had left and the children were finally asleep in their new bedrooms, Jackson and Penelope stood together on the porch of their home, looking out over the moonlit ranch. "Are you sure you know what you have gotten yourself into?" Penelope asked, leaning against his side. Jackson wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Absolutely not, but I am sure that I love you and that together we can handle whatever comes. 16 children, Jackson. There will be chaos. There will be life, he corrected. Love, family. Everything that matters. Penelope tilted her face up to his, and he kissed her, a deeper kiss than their chaste wedding kiss had been, full of promise and passion, and the joy of knowing they had found each other against all odds. The first months of their marriage were indeed chaotic, but wonderfully so. The ranch came alive with children's voices, with laughter and occasional tears, with the constant motion of young people growing and learning. Emma blossomed under the tutelage of Jackson's head ranch hand, developing into a skilled horsewoman. The twins, Thomas and Timothy, followed Jackson everywhere, learning the work of ranching with eager dedication. The younger children thrived with space to play and good food to eat, growing healthier and happier with each passing week. Joshua and Jeremy, who had once been so quiet and withdrawn, became leaders among the children, showing the others around the ranch and teaching them the things they had learned. They called Penelope Mother within weeks of the wedding, and the first time Jeremy said it, Penelope had to leave the room to compose herself. So moved was she by the gift of their trust and love. The expanded ranch required more work, but Jackson found that many of the older children were eager to help, and he began teaching them the skills they would need to make their way in the world, whether they stayed on the ranch or eventually ventured out on their own. It was satisfying work, shaping young lives, giving children who had known loss and hardship the tools to build good futures. Penelope managed the household with the same patient efficiency she had shown at the orphanage, but there was a lightness to her now that had not been there before. She no longer bore the burden of caring for the children alone, and she had a partner who supported her completely. She still sang to the children every night, going from room to tuck each one in with a lullaby, and Jackson often accompanied her, learning the words to songs he had never known. Their private time together was precious and limited with so many children in the house, but they cherished every moment. Late at night, after all the children were asleep, they would sit together by the fire, talking about their day, making plans for the future, simply enjoying each other's presence. And in the quiet dark of their bedroom, they came together with passion and tenderness, building a physical intimacy that matched the emotional connection they shared. Spring brought new life to the ranch, including a discovery that filled both Jackson and Penelope with joy and a touch of trepidation. Penelope was pregnant. After the initial shock wore off, they laughed at the absurdity of it, of adding another child to their already overflowing household. But the joy was real and deep, the chance to create a child together, a living symbol of their love. The children were thrilled when they shared the news. The older girls immediately began planning and preparing, eager to help with the baby. The boys were less interested in the details but pleased nonetheless. Joshua, ever thoughtful, asked Penelope privately if having a baby meant she would love the rest of them less. "Oh, sweetheart, no," Penelope assured him, pulling him close. "Love is not a finite thing that gets divided up. It multiplies. The more people you love, the more love you have to give. This baby will be a blessing, but it does not change how much I love you and all the other children. You are all my children, every single one of you." Satisfied, Joshua had nodded and gone back to his chores, but Penelope had shared the conversation with Jackson that night, and they had both marveled at the resilience and depth of children's hearts. The baby was born on a warm September evening, with the assistance of the town doctor and Mrs. Donnelly, who proved surprisingly skilled as a midwife. It was a long labor, and Jackson paced the floor downstairs with Emma keeping him company, both of them jumping at every sound from above. When the baby's cry finally rang out, strong and healthy, Jackson bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. He entered the bedroom to find Penelope propped against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "A son," she said softly. "We have a son." Jackson approached reverently, looking down at the red-faced, squalling infant. His son. Their son. A wave of love so intense it was almost painful washed over him. "What shall we name him?" Penelope asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on anything definite. Jackson looked at his wife, at the woman who had brought so much love and life into his world, and the answer came to him. "James," he said. "James Daniel Jennings, after both our fathers." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. Her father had been named James and Jackson's had been Daniel. "It is perfect," she whispered. The children were allowed in to meet their new brother shortly after, filing in quietly, eyes wide with wonder. Even the youngest seemed to understand that this was a momentous occasion. Jeremy insisted on holding the baby immediately and under careful supervision. He cradled little James with surprising gentleness for a 6-year-old. "He is so small," Jeremy marveled. "Were we all this small once?" "You were," Jackson confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. "All of you." As Jackson looked around the room at all the faces, at the family they had built together, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. Life had dealt him terrible blows, had taken his first wife and daughter, had left him grieving and alone. But it had also given him this, a house full of love, a wife he adored, children who brought him joy every single day. The path had been painful, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be. The years that followed were full ones. Jackson and Penelope's family continued to grow, not just through births but through the occasional addition of children who needed homes. Word had spread about the ranch family that took in orphans, and sometimes sheriffs or church groups would contact them about children in desperate situations. They never turned away a child in genuine need, though they were careful to ensure they had the resources to provide properly for each new addition. James was joined by a sister, 2 years later, a daughter they named Margaret Rose, honoring both Jackson's first wife and the daughter he had lost. Penelope had suggested the name, her generous heart wanting to honor the woman who had come before her, the mother of Joshua and Jeremy. Jackson had been moved beyond words by the gesture. 3 years after that came another son, Matthew, who had his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn determination. The house that Jackson had built for his first family, and then expanded for his second, had to be expanded again, growing into a sprawling compound that housed what some in town jokingly called the Jennings Orphanage Ranch. But it was not an orphanage. It was a family, bound not always by blood but always by love. The older orphans who had come with Penelope grew into capable young adults. Emma eventually married one of the ranch hands, a good man who had proven himself over years of hard work, and they built a house on the far edge of the ranch property. She remained involved in the horse breeding program she had helped Jackson establish, developing a reputation for training some of the finest horses in California. Thomas and Timothy, the twins, went into business together, starting a freight company that served the growing towns of Northern California. They remained close to the family, visiting often and crediting Jackson and Penelope with giving them the stability and education they needed to succeed. Not all the children stayed in ranching or even in California. Sarah, the quiet girl with the serious eyes, developed a passion for teaching and went to school to become a teacher herself, eventually running a school for children in San Francisco. Others found their callings in various trades and professions, but all remained connected to the ranch and to the family that had given them a second chance. Joshua and Jeremy grew into fine young men, both choosing to remain on the ranch and help their father run the expanding operation. They remembered their birth mother with love and honored her memory, but they also knew that Penelope had been the mother who raised them, who sang to them and comforted them and shaped them into the men they became. Through all the years, through the challenges and joys, the constant was the love between Jackson and Penelope. Their relationship deepened and matured, growing from that initial attraction and tentative courtship into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and profound affection. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jackson arranged for the older children to watch the younger ones and took Penelope on a rare trip away from the ranch. They traveled to San Francisco, staying in a hotel and enjoying the luxury of time alone together, something that was precious and rare in their busy household. On their last evening, as they walked along the waterfront watching the sun set over the Pacific, Penelope squeezed Jackson's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Taking on so many children, so much responsibility, Jackson stopped walking and turned to face his wife. At 47, she was still beautiful to him, perhaps more so than ever. There was silver threading through her auburn hair now, and lines marked her face, but to him, she was perfect. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "You and those children are the best thing that ever happened to me." "Well, you and all our children, the ones who came with you and the ones we made together." Penelope smiled, the same gentle smile that had captivated him that first day when he heard her singing through the orphanage window. "I worried sometimes in those early days that we were making a mistake, that the logistics would overwhelm the love. But we did it, Jackson. We built something beautiful." "We did," he agreed. "Though I think you deserve most of the credit. I just provided the land and the resources." "You provided the heart." "We both provided the heart," Penelope corrected. "That has always been our strength, that we were partners in this from the beginning." They continued their walk, hand in hand, talking about their children, about the grandchildren that were starting to appear as the oldest of their brood married and started families of their own, about the future of the ranch and what they hoped to see in the years to come. When they returned to the ranch, they were greeted with a surprise party, organized by their children in conspiracy with Mrs. Donnelly, who was still with them though well into her 80s now and officially retired. The house was decorated with ribbons and flowers, and a feast had been prepared. All of their children who could make it had come, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. After dinner, as the party was winding down and some of the younger children were growing sleepy, someone called for Penelope to sing. It had become a tradition at family gatherings, and she never refused. She stood in the middle of the parlor, surrounded by her family, and began to sing the lullaby she had been singing that day 20 years ago when Jackson first heard her. Her voice was older now, not quite as pure as it had been in her youth, but it was rich with warmth and experience, carrying the weight of 2 decades of love and life. As she sang, Jackson watched their children, all of them, from grown adults to sleepy toddlers, and saw the love in their faces. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence, then applause and more than a few tears. James, now 19 and already showing the leadership qualities that would one day make him a fine rancher, stood to make a toast. "To our parents," he said, raising his glass, "who showed us that family is not just about blood, but about love and commitment and choosing each other every single day. Thank you for building this family, for building this home, for showing us what it means to love without limits." "To Mother and Father," the chorus echoed, glasses raised around the room. Jackson caught Penelope's eye across the room and smiled. She smiled back, her eyes bright with happy tears, and mouthed 3 words that still made his heart skip a beat even after 20 years. "I love you." As the party continued around them, Jackson made his way to his wife's side and pulled her close. "I love you too," he whispered into her hair. "Thank you for that day 20 years ago when you agreed to come sing for my children. Thank you for saying yes to a crazy plan to take on 14 orphans. Thank you for building this life with me." "Thank you for listening," Penelope replied, wrapping her arms around him. "Thank you for hearing not just my singing but what was in my heart. Thank you for seeing those children as blessings instead of burdens. Thank you for loving me." They stood that way for a long moment, holding each other in the middle of the chaos and joy of their large family. Two people who had found each other when they both needed it most, and had built something extraordinary together. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges as all years do. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick cattle and damaged crops, the normal trials of ranching life. There were sorrows, too, as Mrs. Donnelly passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89, and as Jackson's father, who had moved to a small cottage on the ranch property in his final years, followed her a few years later. But there were far more joys than sorrows. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with a new generation. The ranch prospered under the management of Jackson and his sons, expanding and modernizing while still maintaining the values of hard work and integrity that Jackson had learned from his own father. Penelope, even as she aged, never stopped singing. She sang to her grandchildren as she had sung to her children, passing on the lullabies and songs that had been such an integral part of her gift to the world. Several of the grandchildren showed musical talent, and she encouraged them with patience and pride. On a warm summer evening in 1908, 30 years after that first meeting at the orphanage, Jackson and Penelope sat together on the porch swing they had installed years ago. Jackson was 72 now, his hair completely white, his face lined with age but his eyes still bright. Penelope, at 67, moved a bit slower than she once had, but her spirit remained youthful and her smile still lit up her face. They could hear children's voices from the yard, great-grandchildren now, playing in the twilight under the watchful eyes of their parents. Inside the house, there was the sound of women preparing dinner, of men discussing the day's work, of the constant pleasant noise of a family gathering. "Do you remember that first day?" Penelope asked, her head resting on Jackson's shoulder. "When you stood outside the orphanage window and listened to me sing?" "Every detail," Jackson replied. "I remember thinking your voice was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I remember seeing you with those children and knowing somehow that you were going to change my life." "Did you know you would fall in love with me?" Penelope asked, a teasing note in her voice. "Not that first day, no, but soon after." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "How could I not? You were everything I needed, everything my boys needed. You were light walking into a dark place." "You were pretty wonderful yourself," Penelope said. "A man willing to take on 14 orphans for the sake of love is not common. A woman who dedicated her life to caring for children who were not hers, who gave them love and stability and a future. That is not common either," Jackson countered. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, rocking gently, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "I had a good life," Penelope said softly. Jackson stiffened slightly. "Had? You are speaking in past tense, my love," Penelope smiled. "I have a good life. I was just thinking how fortunate I have been, how blessed. I was an orphan with nothing, and look at what I have now. A husband I adore, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who fill my days with joy, a home that is bursting with love. Not many people get to build something this beautiful." "We built it together," Jackson reminded her. "And we are not done yet. We have many more years ahead of us." "We do," Penelope agreed. and I plan to fill them with the same things that have filled all our years: love, family, and singing, always singing. As if summoned by her words, one of their granddaughters called from the yard, "Grandma Penny, will you sing for us, please?" Penelope laughed and called back, "Of course, darling. What would you like to hear?" The request came for the lullaby, the same one she had been singing for more than 40 years now, the one that had brought Jackson to her door that fateful day. She began to sing, her voice carrying across the yard, and the children stopped their play to listen, drawn by the same magic that had captivated so many before them. Jackson listened too, as he had listened that first time, but now he was not an outsider looking in. He was part of this, part of the love and the family and the life that Penelope's songs had always represented. He had asked her to sing for his children 30 years ago, never imagining that request would lead to this, to a love that spanned decades, to a family that numbered in the dozens, to a life rich beyond any measure of wealth. When the song ended, Penelope settled back against Jackson's shoulder, and they continued to rock gently as the evening deepened into night around them. Inside the house, their family gathered around the dinner table, talking and laughing, living the life that two people had built together through love and faith, and an unwavering commitment to each other, and to the children they had chosen to raise. "Thank you," Jackson said quietly. "For what?" Penelope asked. "For everything. For saying yes all those years ago, for loving my boys, for marrying me, for building this family, for every song, every smile, every moment of these 30 years. Thank you for choosing me." Penelope turned her face up to his, and even in the dim light, he could see the love shining in her eyes. "And thank you for choosing me, for seeing past the orphan girl to the woman I could become with the right partner. Thank you for listening to me sing and hearing what I was really offering." He kissed her then, a gentle kiss full of tenderness and enduring love, the kiss of two people who had walked through life together and would continue to do so for whatever years remained to them. From the house came the call that dinner was ready, and slowly, still holding hands, Jackson and Penelope made their way inside to join their family. The table was crowded, multiple generations squeezed together, sharing food and stories and love. This was what they had built, this abundance of connection and caring, this legacy of choosing love over fear, of opening their hearts and their home to anyone who needed it. As Jackson looked around the table, seeing faces he loved, hearing laughter and conversation, feeling Penelope's hand in his, he thought back to that day 30 years ago when grief and loneliness had driven him to stand outside an orphanage window, drawn by the sound of a voice singing lullabies to orphans. He had gone there seeking something for his children, but he had found so much more. He had found love, purpose, a future brighter than any he could have imagined. The cowboy had listened, had asked her to sing for his children, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the greatest blessings come in unexpected packages, wrapped in song and tied with ribbons of courage and faith. Their story, which had begun with a simple lullaby, had become an epic of love, family, and the enduring power of choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through all the joys and sorrows life could bring. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments of evening, neighbors passing by the Jennings ranch could hear the faint sound of singing drifting on the breeze, they would smile and remember the story of the woman who sang lullabies to orphans and the cowboy who listened, who asked her to sing for his children, and who found in that simple request the key to a lifetime of love and happiness that blessed not just two people, but generations to come.